Well, and another part of the calculus that's different is that one of the people who are has the most to say about Russia is former president and perhaps maybe again President Trump, and that's certainly a giant influence in everything when it comes to Russia. So we're all gonna have to wait and see what happens and see. Could be I'll keep my own politics out of it, but certainly that's the elephant in the room. Should we go to the next question?
Yes. With the new propaganda rising up due to technologies like AI and deep fakes, what will the fight for a better Russia look like in the next few months?
Well, if that's for me, I would say that, I mean, there is enormous creativity among the exiles in terms of their ability to use technology. And I haven't heard too much about the AI dimension of it, but they're pretty ingenious, I think, in getting their messages across. And so I just expect that to intensify. I don't think anyone has anything on the Russians when it comes to using these tools. We're very familiar with Russian disinformation techniques and so forth, and that the state is advancing, but I think that those tools are equally available to the Russians who are now outside of Russia seeking to influence things. So I just think this information war will just intensify and take place on a number of these planes.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, Paul, a lot of the Russians who left in the last couple of years are the tech people who are very adept at all of these things.
A lot of them.
Yeah. So James Brooks asks, Paul, what are the prospects for various exile secessionist groups, regional and ethnic?
Does he mean, okay, I guess we're not gonna be able to ask what he means, like those who want to break up Russia in some sense? How do you interpret that question? I guess I'm not quite sure I understand it.
But to break away from Russia, he's saying.
Oh. So, which ones does he have in mind? Like the, I mean, I see, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. I think Putin is trying to gather Russian peoples into this greater Russia, which Ukraine is certainly part of that. Just the other day, these secessionists in Moldova, they occupy this kind of separatist, enclave, asked for quote unquote protection from Russia, which sounded to me like, maybe the Kremlin has written their, protection plea. And similarly, there is a very large Russian ethnic minority in eastern Latvia on the border with Russia. And the Latvians, I have to say, they're kind of cracking down on the use of the Russian language and so forth, which sort of feeds into Putin's agenda because his whole thing is about protecting, the Russian peoples, the people who speak the Russian language. And so that just sort of feeds into him. So I think the prospect is for more Putin meddling in these various conflicts. And we also, we already have Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I mean, there are all these like little or not so little places that are kind of affiliated in some way with Russia that nobody else recognizes. Who recognizes Abkhazia? I think maybe like North Korea, maybe. I was there once. I almost got trapped there, actually. It's not a great place.
Go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
Put my oar in. I just heard something about sort of separatist sentiment in Yakutia, which they call the Sakha. But the trouble is, it's quite difficult if you're in the middle of Siberia to secede. You don't have a navigable ocean to connection to the outside world. If you're a Buryat, you've got Russia on 3 sides and China on the 4th side. China is not going to welcome any split, they would see. So it's quite difficult to imagine it. And if it were going to happen, it would be more on the Yugoslav level because the there are in every one of these autonomous republics, there are large minorities, if not majorities of Russian or Slavs, Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. So it's not going to be easy for these to split.
No.
There is nationalist feeling growing inside the Russian Federation. Not really a federation, actually. It's not really a state. It's still a sort of empire, still a sort of land empire. But it's quite hard unless you have a sort of some seaboard to think about seceding. The Chechens, of course, didn't manage it.
I was
Yeah.
going to say, given what he did, given Chechnya and now Ukraine, I can't see Putin giving more sovereignty to some of the smaller groups inside. And Alan, in reading your book, I just found it so sad to think about parts of Ukraine. Like you look back and you say, in the Civil War, after the Bolsheviks took over, Ukraine people died by the millions. Then they died in the famine. Then in Hitler's invasion, a lot of the same towns. I mean, it was so striking. Names I would have never known except for the last couple years. The towns where we've seen fighting the past couple years had fighting during World War II. And then, 2014 Crimea, and now, I mean, I'm glad I don't live there.
Yeah. Ukraine is a sort of often neglected, but you could write a lot of the 20th century history based on what happened to Ukraine, and and I think Stalin did actually accept that because Russia didn't have any far-flung parts of its empire beyond the seas, it had to treat Ukraine basically like a colony and beggar it for all it's worth to extract all the agriculture and other resources. So yes, a lot of history can be rewritten if you put Ukraine at the center of it. Unfortunately.
So, Paul, do you have any last comments? We're getting close to the time that we need to sign off.
Right. Well, one tiny addition about as I think about it, the secessionists. I mean, one thing people need to understand is that the exiles are not just the people like the liberal type people from Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, I met plenty of people who come from Siberia, for example, and I think a pervasive theme is guilt. It's an age-old Russian theme. I have a chapter in my book about guilt, and I was just struck in meeting, one person after another, that it was almost like I was, they wanted to confess to me. I mean, I sat down with a writer in Tbilisi for a drink one evening, and the first thing she asked me is, "Are we guilty?" And I mean, I guess if you ask that question, you're saying in a way, yeah, we are. And there's this sense that they were responsible in some way for what happened in the Russian family, with Putin not doing enough to oppose him. And so there's a lot that can be done with guilt and shame and so forth. And maybe in some ways that can engender something good. But I am afraid that we're in a fairly dark period right now. And as you said, Patty, it's a long game.
Alan, do you have any last comments?
I think I've shot my bolt. I don't see. I was quite struck by one thing I read after Navalny's death, and that was a piece written by Mikhail Shishkin, and he was accompanying Navalny a few years ago in the provinces, and a man came up to Navalny and said, "Oh, I really like you and I like what you say." And Navalny said, "Will you vote for me?" And the man looked a bit unsettled, and he said, "Well, I really like you, but when you're president, I'll vote for you. I'll vote for you when you're president." And this anecdote seems to seems to encapsulate one aspect of not of the liberal cities, but of the deep provinces, that people don't really feel that it's up to them to choose the leader. They're happy to vote to acclaim someone presented to them. But the idea that they have the right to choose the leader still seems to be a bit distant to them. So I'm afraid I don't see enormous changes happening very soon.
Well, I think with that, unless Beth, you have something else you want to add,
No, I just wanted to thank Alan for joining us so late British time. Staying up so late.
It's a cold and rainy night, so I found one of those naked parties.
Yeah, here's. I only have an electronic copy of your book.
I can
Paul,
see
but
you there.
Here's The Red Hotel. It's really a marvelous book. They're both marvelous books.
Yes,
and Patty,
and they're in the chat. You can buy the books, find the links in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me, Patty, and glad to see you again, Beth, and pleased to meet you, Alan.
Right. Okay. Well, it's great to talk to you, and even by Zoom, which has worked perfectly, hasn't it? No complaints.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And maybe Patty, you can just speak about the next event that we're having for maybe of interest to people who enjoyed this panel.
Yes, on March 13th, we're having a book called News Hawks in Berlin, which is kind of the Western correspondents trying to cover Hitler, equivalent to Alan's book of them trying to cover Stalin. And it's by two AP people, one a longtime journalist, one a researcher, and Ann Cooper helped finish it up. Larry Heinzerling is her husband, who died a few years ago, and Randy Hershaft is the researcher, and then Anne helped finish the book after Larry died. And it's a very open book about the conflicts that AP had covering Hitler, particularly with their German photography joint venture or subsidiary. So it's another story about how covering fascist governments is very difficult. So, all right, thank you, everybody. It was a wonderful program.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.